In African folklore, the trickster isn't just a fool. He's also a cultural hero, a figure who shapes and defines the world through his cunning, even if he occasionally stumbles along the way. Let's journey to the Ashanti people of present-day Ghana, where one of the most famous tales about Anansi, the spider, reveals just how a trickster can become a hero. Imagine this. Anansi, the cunning spider, approaches the powerful sky god Wulbari. He wants to buy the sky god's stories, all of them. Now, think about that for a moment. What kind of audacity does it take to ask a god to sell his stories? The sky god, of course, isn't eager to part with them, but Anansi won't take no for an answer. He insists, pleads, and finally the sky god relents, but with a catch. He tells Anansi that he can have the stories, but only if he can bring him 4 impossible things: a python, a leopard, a swarm of hornets, and a fairy. Can you imagine? These tasks weren't just difficult. They were meant to be outright impossible. The sky god was certain that the spider would give up. But Anansi was no ordinary spider. He was a trickster, born to outsmart, deceive, and ultimately prevail. So how does a tiny spider catch a mighty python? Anansi hatches a clever plan. He and his wife take a long pole down to the python's lair and begin a loud, staged argument. They argue about whether the python is longer or shorter than the pole. Of course, they're arguing so loudly that the python overhears them and slithers over, curious about the commotion. "What's all this noise about?" the python asks. "We're just debating whether you're longer than this pole," Anansi replies casually. "But we can't seem to agree." The python, proud and certain, insists, "Well, let's settle this now. I'll lay next to the pole so you can see for yourselves." And as soon as the python stretches out beside the pole, Anansi quickly ties him up. One task down. Now, capturing the leopard required more than just ropes and trickery. It took nerve. Anansi dug a deep pit and covered it with leaves and sticks, then lured the leopard into it. As for the hornets, Anansi tricked them by pretending it was raining. He poured water over a leaf, convincing the hornets to seek shelter inside a hollowed-out gourd. Once they were safely inside, he swiftly sealed the opening, trapping them. With that, 3 impossible tasks were complete. Only one remained. The final challenge was the fairy. But how do you trap a magical being? Anansi's solution was as simple as it was ingenious. He fashioned a doll, covered it in sticky sap, and placed a bowl of fruit in its lap. Then he hid nearby, holding a string attached to the doll's arm. Soon enough, a fairy came along and, seeing the fruit, asked if she could have some. Anansi tugged the string, making the doll's head nod a yes. The fairy took a fruit, thanked the doll, and waited for a reply. But the doll remained silent. Irritated, she scolded it for being rude. When the doll still didn't respond, the fairy grew angry and slapped it. And that was all it took. Her hand stuck fast. She struck again with her other hand, and that, too, became stuck. Before long, she had kicked the doll in frustration and was entirely trapped. Anansi triumphantly carried the fairy to the sky god along with the other captives, but he didn't stop there. In a final twist, he offered the sky god his own mother as a bonus. This grand gesture finally won over the sky god, who gave Anansi all the stories of the world. From that day forward, they were known as Anansi stories. So, why tell this story? It's more than just a tale of cleverness and trickery. It's about challenging the impossible, finding ways to triumph where others see only obstacles. Anansi's triumph isn't just in outsmarting a god, it's in reshaping the world itself. In capturing the python, leopard, hornets, and fairy, Anansi isn't merely fulfilling a list of tasks. He's changing the natural order, bending the world to his will, and in the process, becoming a hero who redefines the boundaries of what is possible. And what about the sky god's stories? They didn't stay in the heavens. They came down to earth, to the people. Anansi brought stories to the world, stories that would be told and retold, shaping generations. His tricks might seem mischievous, even foolish at times, but they carried a deeper purpose. Because, in the end, isn't the real magic of the trickster in showing us that there's always another way to see the world? That with a little bit of cunning and a lot of courage, even the impossible can be brought within reach? Anansi's tale is not just about outwitting gods and capturing creatures, it's about daring to challenge the limits set before us and, in doing so, creating something entirely new. So, as you walk away from this story, ask yourself, what impossible tasks do you need to face? And how can you, like Anansi, find a way to turn the world in your favor? In another tale featuring Anansi and the sky god Wulbari, we are taken back to the dawn of time, when the sky god rested so near to Mother Earth that nothing could exist between them. There was no sky, no open space, just the sky god's belly pressing against the ground. But something had to give. Over time, Wulbari was pushed further and further away, forced to retreat, leaving an empty sky above and the earth below. But why? What made the great sky god rise up and leave? There are many tales that try to answer that question. Some say an old woman was outside her hut pounding fufu, and she kept jabbing him with her long wooden spoon. Others claim that people were constantly wiping their dirty hands on the sky because it was so close, like a napkin that hung just above their heads. Another story says it was the smoke from their fires, stinging Wulbari's eyes day after day. And yet another version tells of an old woman who, every day, would cut a piece of the sky to add to her soup. Can you picture it? The sky god, reduced to a mere ingredient for a pot of stew. Whatever the reason, Wulbari had enough. He felt pressured, annoyed, and finally decided to rise, creating the distance between heaven and earth that we know today. But even with the sky up high, he still needed someone to watch over it. So he appointed the crafty Anansi as his captain. One day, Anansi approached Wulbari with an outrageous request. "Give me a single stalk of grain and I'll return with 100 slaves for you." Wulbari was doubtful. One stalk of grain in exchange for 100 slaves? It sounded like a trick. But curiosity got the better of him, and he gave Anansi the stalk, curious to see how this would unfold. Anansi descended to the earth, reaching a village where he announced that the stalk of grain was a sacred gift from the sky god himself. "This grain must be guarded," he warned the villagers, "especially when Wulbari sleeps." But late at night, when everyone else was resting, Anansi fed the stalk to the village chickens. The next morning, he demanded the grain back. Panic spread like wildfire when the villagers saw it had been eaten. They were terrified of angering the sky god and quickly offered Anansi a large basket of grain to make up for the loss. Anansi accepted the grain and continued on his way, soon meeting a stranger who eagerly traded his bird for the basket of grain. Now, with the bird in hand, Anansi reached another village and declared that the bird was a precious gift from Wulbari and must be watched over. But once again, in the middle of the night, Anansi killed the bird and smeared its blood on the chief's door. The following morning, chaos erupted when the villagers discovered the dead bird. Fearing the wrath of Wulbari, they offered Anansi 10 sheep as compensation. The trickster didn't stop there. He went on to a third village where he found a funeral procession for a young man. Seizing the opportunity, Anansi traded the 10 sheep for the young man's body, then brought the corpse to another village. There, he claimed, "This young man isn't dead, just a very heavy sleeper. He is Wulbari's son, and you must care for him." Anansi dined well that night, eating enough for 2 to convince the villagers that Wulbari's son had indeed woken up and eaten. The next morning, when the chief's son tried to wake the young man, Anansi suggested he might need a little encouragement, perhaps a light beating. But the young man didn't wake, and Anansi cried out, "Oh no, you've beaten Wulbari's son to death!" The villagers were beside themselves with fear, certain that they had doomed themselves. Anansi, ever the problem solver, offered to take the blame. All he asked for was 100 young men to accompany him back to Wulbari and confirm his story. Grateful for his sacrifice, the villagers sent the 100 young men with him. Anansi led them straight to Wulbari, delivering exactly what he promised, 100 slaves. Anansi's cleverness impressed everyone, even himself. In fact, he became so self-assured that he started to think he was just as wise as Wulbari. The sky god wasn't amused by this arrogance and decided to humble him with a task. "Go down to earth and bring me something," Wulbari commanded. "What should I bring?" asked Anansi, puzzled. "If you're truly as clever as you think, you'll know what I want," Wulbari replied. Anansi was stumped. How could he possibly know what Wulbari desired? He returned to earth and summoned all the birds of the land. From each he took a single feather and wove them together into the most spectacular cloak anyone had ever seen. A cloak that made him look like a strange, beautiful, and exotic bird. He flew back to the sky and perched in a tree near Wulbari's court. The people marveled at the sight, for they had never seen a bird like this. "What kind of bird is that?" they wondered aloud. Surely Anansi would know. But Wulbari chuckled. "Anansi isn't here," he said. "He's on Earth fetching something for me." "Something? What is it?" the people asked. Wulbari replied, "He doesn't know, because I didn't tell him. He must bring me darkness, the moon, and the sun." Anansi, who had overheard Wulbari's words, knew what he had to do. Though the story doesn't explain how, Anansi eventually returned to Wulbari's court carrying a large sack. "Did you bring me something?" Wulbari asked. Without a word, Anansi opened the sack, and out came darkness, engulfing everything. He opened the sack a little wider, and the moon appeared, casting a pale light. Finally, he released the sun, its brightness flooding the world. Those who had stared directly at the sun lost their sight, while those who had closed one eye became half-blind, and those who had looked away kept their vision intact. And that, they say, is how blindness entered the world, because Wulbari had asked Anansi to fetch something. This tale captures everything that defines a trickster story: cunning, mischief, and transformation. But Anansi isn't just a trickster, he's a cultural hero. His deeds don't merely entertain, they explain the world, how the sun, the moon, and even blindness came into existence. So think about it. Isn't Anansi more than just a spider who tricks his way through life? He's the one who reshapes reality, teaches us to question what's possible, and reminds us that sometimes even a trickster can change the world. Let me tell you another tale of Anansi, the infamous trickster, and a man known as hates to be contradicted. Now, this man wasn't like everyone else. He lived alone, outside the village, far away from the chatter and company of others. Yet people came by all the time, drawn by curiosity. What was so special about this man who couldn't stand being told he was wrong? Every time a visitor sat beneath the palm tree by his house, a few nuts would inevitably fall. And every time, without fail, they'd say, "Oh, those nuts look ripe." But then, hates to be contradicted would start spinning his wild tale. He'd say, "When the nuts ripen, they ripen in bunches of 3. I take those 3 nuts, boil them down to extract their oil, and the oil is enough to fill 3 water jars. I carry those jars all the way to Akasi and sell the oil. With the money, I buy an old woman from Akasi and bring her back home. She gives birth to my grandmother, who gives birth to my mother, and then my mother gives birth to me. And there I am, already standing here." A tale so bizarre it makes your head spin, right? But every time, visitors couldn't help themselves. They would say, "That's impossible." And whenever they contradicted him, hates to be contradicted would rise up in anger and strike them down. News of this man reached Anansi, who was always on the lookout for a good challenge. He decided to visit Hates to be Contradicted himself. As expected, the man told his wild story, and Anansi, instead of disagreeing, said, "That's not so unbelievable." Then Anansi began his own tall tale. "On my farm," he said, "I grow okra plants so tall that I have to tie together 77 poles just to reach them. And when even those poles aren't long enough, I use my own, well, let's just say I use a very personal extension, my penis, to harvest them." The man was taken aback by this outrageous claim and said, "I'd like to see that for myself." Anansi, never one to miss an opportunity, replied, "Come by tomorrow. I'll be harvesting the okra then, and you can see for yourself." On his way home, Anansi chewed on some pine nuts, staining his spit red, and left a trail of red marks along the path. When he reached his house, he told his children to prepare for the visitor. "When that man comes," Anansi said, "tell him I broke my penis in 7 places and went to the blacksmith to have it repaired." The next day, Hates to be Contradicted showed up, just as Anansi expected. The children told him, "Our father's not here. He's at the blacksmith's fixing his, well, you know." The man asked, "Where's your mother then?" "She's at the river," the children replied. "Yesterday she dropped a water jar that breaks if it hits the ground, but she didn't have time to catch it before it fell. So she's gone back today to catch it before it hits the ground." Hates to be Contradicted was baffled by their story. How could someone catch a jar that had already fallen? But he held his tongue. When Anansi finally returned, he served the man a soup so spicy that it brought tears to his eyes. Hates to be Contradicted gasped, begging for water. "Fetching water isn't that simple," said Anansi's son. "The water jar has 3 layers. The water on top is for my father, the middle is for my father's other wife, and the bottom is for our mother. If we give you the wrong water, it'll cause a terrible uproar in the village." At this point, Hates to be Contradicted could hardly contain himself. The stories were getting more ridiculous by the minute. Finally, he shouted, "You're lying!" That was the moment Anansi had been waiting for. He and his children leaped up, grabbed Hates to be Contradicted, and killed him on the spot. They chopped his body into tiny pieces and scattered them all across the village. And from that day forward, the man's stubborn nature was dispersed throughout the entire community. What makes this story so compelling? It's not just about trickery for trickery's sake. This tale shows us the kind of disruption a trickster can bring into an otherwise orderly society. Hates to be Contradicted lived on the outskirts, isolated and rejecting the norms of social and biological order. He couldn't bear even the slightest challenge to his outlandish stories. But Anansi, who was at home with his family and very much part of the social fabric, defeated Hates to be Contradicted by leaning into that very chaos. He didn't just refute the man's claims, he twisted reality even further, pushing the absurdity to its breaking point. When Anansi and his children scattered the man's remains, it symbolized how the nature of contradiction itself was spread across the village, infecting it with chaos and disruption. What does Anansi teach us here? The trickster always brings something from the outside into society, often something dark, unsettling, and chaotic. In this story, he introduces contradiction into the lives of the villagers, a force that shakes their stability and changes them forever. The village would never be the same. From then on, it would be filled with arguments and contradictions, elements that could spark chaos, but could also be the seeds of change. This concludes the final lesson of our short course on the trickster in mythology. I hope you found it both engaging and thought-provoking, and that it sparked a desire to explore this fascinating mythological figure even further. The trickster is a complex character who appears in myths across the globe, and there's always more to uncover about their role in shaping cultural narratives. If you're interested in diving deeper into mythology, I invite you to join my upcoming course on North American mythology, where we will explore various aspects of Native American myths, from creation stories to hero legends, and the rich symbolism found within these traditions. And don't forget to subscribe to the Academy of History and Culture for more insights into history, mythology, and culture. Thank you for being part of this journey, and I look forward to seeing you in future courses.